everybody, and thank you for joining us today for our webinar on Azure Virtual Desktop and Windows 365 and GCC High and Azure Government. This promises to be a great session, so I want to just get started. I'd like to introduce our host, Agile IT CEO, Conrad Ankerbach.
Hey everybody, thanks for joining us. Give me 1 second to, I had to share my screen here. All right, everybody, so for this session, really we wanted to talk about Windows 365, Azure Virtual Desktop. Some of this might be a little bit of a primer for you. Some might already know a lot of this information and kind of the beginning part, but stick with me on this because really there's a few kind of areas in terms of scenarios. One of the biggest areas that customers really look at this is really, should we do this? And a lot of times the answers come from, well, what kind of architecture do you have? What will your architecture be in terms of your environment? I'm going to walk through some different scenarios there to give us some context, and then talk a little bit about how that really starts to influence, which decision you can make. And by the way, a lot of times, we're saying, is it, one versus the other? Is it both? And it really isn't. It is a and scenario or both. And really, as you go through, we'll talk about, how that you can make decisions based off of where you are. So why a lot of people are here, especially we're focusing on the government side of this, is that there are some particular scenarios that really are available throughout the world, even with outside government. But in government, we have a little bit more information, and really the architecture, because sometimes you might have one tenant, all GCC high, you might have both, multiple tenants. So we'll talk about that, and how does this make your decision of what to go buy? And really, when we look at the cost side of this, it's not just, well, one is per user, one is kind of per user with infrastructure cost, which one's cheaper. And really it's the overall cost shouldn't be looked at just the licensing or what you're going to get on the bill. There's all these other kind of hidden costs around, either the experience of it. We know then things are easier for the users that we're intending to work on, that there's less support calls and issues we have to go through. But there's other scenarios where, in terms of cost management, that is the impact on the IT staff. Who cares about the IT staff? We make those people work late at night and on weekends. Well, that's the traditional way of looking at it. But when they have a lot of burden, it impacts the organization and impacts the user. So that really has to be a part of the understanding of the overall cost. And really, as we go through this, it might feel like I'm leaning you on one versus the other, but it's important to take all these pieces into account before making a purchasing decision. Now, one of the reasons we talk about this, we have other webinars, is because all we do here at Agile IT is focus on really unapologetically on Microsoft Cloud Services and all of the things that it provides. Over the years, it's done as well because Microsoft has continued to invest in all of these areas. And so we like to talk about it broadly, whether you go with us or not, but that's kind of who we are. And this has been kind of a map that we've had for a long time, but it's held true for so much. And one key area that we're talking about here is desktop as a service. And yeah, there's other vendors and tools that can go through this, but the Microsoft platform really has evolved tremendously over the years. And it's something that as we go through this, you kind of want to continue to leverage it. And for those that have really leveraged what's happening in Microsoft 365, whether E3 or E5 or a mixture of items, you're starting to see, even though it's frustrating sometimes, like, hey, they're changing portals and these things, but they're really condensing things down. So I don't see them as so much as a problem because they're not really taking things away. They are changing things to make improvement. But now as you're trying to make a purchasing decision on one or the other, or maybe both, it's important to understand, like, how do those, how do I make that selection, not just on cost, but the capabilities we want to provide to users, the amount of overhead that we have, and the amount of experience that we have within the organization. And the other nice thing that you're starting to really see in today's world, is we're now starting out in 2023, is that it's the ability to use a mixture of these services and starting to really reduce down the amount of tools and products and technologies that you have to go do them, is reducing down. Because now to do a lot of these things, like in Windows 365, and we'll talk about it, and even a little bit on the virtual desktop side, is that they're using common elements, Azure Active Directory based. So now you can have these these users logging in with their Azure Active Directory credentials, and you don't really have to have a local Active Directory. So that's a big improvement. Again, less things that you have to manage. And by the way, when we're managing less things ourselves as an organization, it also means that if you're in the compliance world, which a lot of times if you're in the government space and you're going to GCC high, I mean, there you have some compliance requirements. This could be because of the CMMC, that we have. It could be other departmental regulations that are going this. Everything that I have to take on, right? This is the whole shared responsibility model. Just like we can run Exchange Online, I don't have to worry about the servers and the disks and the data storage locations. Microsoft handles that for me. So they participate in the compliance and the auditing and just remove some overhead. So, this is the place where you start to see that same type of mix and decision making between Windows 365 and Azure Virtual Desktop. And it was confusing for a while because people thought Windows 365, is that my desktop experience? No. However, when we're managing Windows desktops, I have a real computer on my desk and a laptop, and those are managed through the cloud using Endpoint Manager. The same experience, the same environment of managing that is directly inside of Endpoint Manager, which they're changing the name back to Intune. Fun story there. But in that case, I'm leveraging the same investments that I'm managing mobile devices, laptops and phones, laptops or desktop and phones, is the same place I'm going to do Windows 365 management. So kind of that same experience, not a bunch of other portals I have to go through. Azure Virtual Desktop, a little bit different. This place is not so much directly tied to your license. It's more about the infrastructure you have. Although I'll give a little tip about later on about what kind of license you do have might actually decrease the cost of your Azure Virtual Desktop by a fair amount of percentage if you do go that route. So when we talk about the Windows 365, the experience of it, it is a better experience because they're just investing on it and it's changing more. But the flexibility of Azure Virtual Desktop really allows for more flexibility. If you have staff that is more seasonal, or you're doing another great areas, you have a lot of line of business applications that still require a local Active Directory. You can do the same thing in Windows 365, but it's just a little bit more superior on the virtual desktop in terms of your options of networking. But you're still operating kind of a traditional IT environment. So let's first take a look about the user experience. For both of these, one, you can log on to Windows 365, you can go to the portal and you can see what's happening here. If you do it through the Azure Virtual Desktop client, yeah, it's not as pretty, if you will. You can do direct apps that are on there, and people can have different desktops, but I can do that on the left. So it looks a little bit better, but the users can also get a little bit more power. So on the left-hand side here, Windows 365, we're able to the user can. And this is also an option you can. Many of these things or all these things are configurable. They can restart the machine if they want. Now, the Azure Virtual Desktop, you don't really want to have that control. And I'll talk a little bit later about why that's generally not the case, because there's different ways to give that desktop. Again, this goes to the ability to have a little bit more flexibility in cost management, as well as being able to have greater flexibility of options of what they get. Because in Azure Virtual Desktop, you can have dedicated VMs per user, but you can also have shared VMs per user. Hey, in a CUI state, maybe we don't want that. Well, you don't have to. You can do both. Here you can see 3 different desktops for 3 different reasons in both sides. So you can see here that the experience is a little bit different for them. And why does that make it, again, a big deal? Because sometimes that makes a difference for the users and for IT in terms of restarting or not starting. So when you're starting to look at this, again, we're starting to think about first like IT skills that you have. If you're an organization that's been doing VDI for years, it's still on staff, and there's many good reasons why you've done it in the past. It's one you want to keep doing it. Now, that doesn't mean you have to go Azure Virtual Desktop. It just means that it's going to be an easier transition for you, especially if you've already been doing Citrix and you know this world, and there might be other technical requirements why you have to do it in this way. I'll talk a little bit about that later on. But if you don't, this is a place where we really try and encourage customers to go to Windows 365. Again, don't force you. There's lots of scenarios, and we're going to go through them some more of why you might go to Windows 365. But why add infrastructure complexity? Why have to build a new skill set? Either you're going to have a provider like ourselves or somebody else that's going to help you manage that infrastructure if you go to Azure Virtual Desktop, or you're going to train somebody to go do that. But the bad part about training other people is they go on vacation and they leave the organization, whatever that might happen, and you lose the skill. So you can't just have one. It's like Lay's potato chips. You got to have more than them just to manage this thing. So you got to really think, is it worth it? And what do we want to go do? One side note on there, because it's just kind of a general slide. If you're going to be doing things in Windows 3 in GCC Hive with Windows Virtual Desktop, it's going to be enterprise. That's the license you're going to buy. You know, here it says business because it's true, it exists, but you're really not going to use that. So, you know, and then really you can decide to do both if you needed to. You can have Windows 365 running because you have some applications that people use all the time. Again, I'll get to the scenarios that you know, why the kind of mix, but just in general, you might want to have that flex. You might want to have those dedicated, easier to manage for certain business scenarios. Maybe that's where you're doing some of your CUI-based activities. But we also need Virtual Desktop for a lot of our other users, and they don't really need to have dedicated computers. And you know, maybe some of that's for only when they do working from a place that isn't a managed desktop that you have, and you want to provide that, but you don't want to have a fixed cost for that. Excuse me. But you are paying for something. It doesn't come for free. So, you know, again, just starting to build up of what you need, why you need it. There might be certain, you may want to spin up Linux things. Could be, and you want to do that with Windows, and you don't really want to have mixed platforms. You want to have kind of one environment that you can do that in the skill set, but you are going to be bouncing around. The nice thing is on the Windows 365, while you're clicking on different places in the endpoint manager portal, you're kind of all still there. You know, your provisioning policies, your policies that define, you know, that, hey, when they log into this thing, I don't want them to plug in a USB and access that. Everything's just in one spot. In Azure Virtual Desktop, you can leverage some endpoint manager pieces. Well, that's nice, but I also have to go into the Azure portal, you know, to go do certain things. So, you know, it just creates more complexity to have. But again, these are the things you have to balance. If you have experience there, then, you know, that could be a good thing. So, you know, again, just thinking about, you know, what the pricing model is going to be between the two. And again, if you're doing both, you try to understand them. The hard part on the Azure pricing part sometimes is, you know, and one thing that I'll encourage, and maybe we have time, I'll show it, or in the Q&A part of it, is you can go to the Azure pricing calculator. I know it's daunting. A couple things. One, make sure to log into the pricing calculator, because you can save the calculations you put there, and you can even send a link to somebody else that says, here's what we're looking at pricing. But you're going to start to go down a rabbit hole of, well, we need to put our compute cost in, our storage cost, what we think it's going to be, because it's all your profile data. Networking costs, there's networking costs, that amount of network threshold that you get with Windows 365, but you can also use Azure Virtual Network. So one thing to know is that with Windows 365, it does not mean that you can't leverage anything with Azure. Nothing could be further from the truth. You could, and you could still use local Active Directory if you needed it. But, you know, again, get a little ahead of myself here, but, you know, there's a lots of, you know, parts to configure. So, you know, between Cloud PC and Enterprise Manager, like I said, you get the benefits of the kind of single portal experience. You know, all your configuration is there, how you build them, how you manage them, the policy. So it just really makes it nice. You know, and because it's managed that way through Endpoint Manager, we can deploy Defender for endpoints. We can make sure that we're getting data analytics on a regular basis so that we can do our you know, log reporting from it. You can do that as well with, you know, with Azure Virtual Desktop, but it's just more things you have to make sure that you require. So, you know, there it's not just about clicking through or getting it, you know, first stood up, but you have to manage the images. You have to manage your own image gallery. You know, you have to keep that image gallery up to date. You know, well, we use image gallery on the Microsoft side too. What's the difference there? They keep that thing up to date. So when it spins up, it doesn't have to download 400 updates because it's unsecured at that point. Azure Virtual Desktop, you would be responsible for those things. Anyway, we'll talk, you know, I'll talk more about that. But again, it's just that the Windows 365 part of it really helps out. And again, the common theme here is what level of complexity do I want to take on. The one area here, so if we look at the operating systems, so one stark difference is in Windows 365, it is always going to be a single VM, single session for the user. So if they log into their desktop on their laptop, and then they say, oh, I'm going to go to my desktop because I want to do that and have bigger screens, multiple things, which it supports, both of them do. But it's going to log them out as the other one. The other part of it from the Azure Virtual Desktop side of it is I can have what's called multiple sessions running on the same one, and I'm going to have a little graphic on that here in a minute. That'll help understand that a little bit more. But it is key, and I have way more options in terms on the Azure Virtual Desktop side of all of the available virtual machines that are in there. Some that have GPU optimized, so for those that are doing things that are CAD based or SolidWorks or something that requires lots of GPU processing to make that thing hum. Well, you just have a lot more options. Will they have that or some of those things? Windows 365, I bet they will, but it's not there. But the Microsoft stack of VMs continues to grow very fast. So lots of options that you have over there, but with lots of options, sometimes we can create a large amount of mess. So diligence is important and repeatability is important. So if you're going to do anything Azure Virtual Desktop based, it's great to get it stood up quickly and start using it. But automation, repeatability, is going to be key to the game there. When you do that. And so some of the main questions around there, like, hey, we're looking at pricing, and the nice thing on the Windows 365 side, which is also not the nice thing on the Windows 365 side, is that it's a predictable monthly price per user, but you have to pay it, even if they don't use it, even if they use it sometimes, that they're going to have it, and it's tied to a user. Yes, you can release it from the user, remove that license. Group-based licensing here is key, and then you can apply it to somebody else, but it's still there. And so one thing, especially for those that are in the GCC high space, as you all know, you have to, because it is that license, as soon as you buy it, you got to pay it pretty much for the whole year. Some people doing it per month, it's crazy, but it's it's for the whole year. So it's kind of not just predictable, I'm making a dedicated thing, and that cost is for the actual compute and memory size that they have. What if they move up? Why have to buy another license? But you can get the license you did have and reassign it to somebody else. But now I'm making some bigger, much bigger decisions that have a long-term effect, where when you're looking at the Azure Virtual Desktop, you have a lot more freedom and flexibility, which could be ideal for contractors and things that you're working on. But again, I'm managing that, I have more responsibilities for that. Is it worth, the savings of maybe, for a given license? I'm just making a number up here, and that's also hard too. Well, what does the infrastructure cost divided by number of people? Well, it's not always so simple, again, because you have to manage all that infrastructure. But what am I really saving, especially if I don't have experience on there? It's more to it than just, again, the licensing and the compute cost. So let's talk a little bit about the Azure Virtual Desktop, because as I was saying, it has its own method. So if you're looking at these two gray bar areas here, Microsoft's really doing this. So if you did VDI in the past, that there's the standing up of the servers, that is the remote desktop thing, right? The VMs itself or whatever, but it has to be coordinated. So when people go into log into the website or use the remote app desktop clients or the web browser, it has to talk to something. And if I have, if I want it load balanced and make sure it's managed and has access and a firewall, I had to do all those things before. So now, at least on the Microsoft side with Azure Virtual Desktop, they're saying we take care of all of those parts, right? The web access, you don't run a server that does web access, they have it, right? You just set up the policies that hey, we have this pool of users and who gets access, and we're kind of managing this middle part or subscription that we have control of the virtual machines. And yes, you have those virtual machines, and you can use, you'll end up using Azure Automation in order to do a lot of your update management. So that makes it easy. Or you can use auto manage to do it, which is its own kind of pros and cons. So yeah, there's a lot of tools on the Azure side, and which you can, by the way, also use on premises. So if you have on-prem servers, so maybe this is kind of a way you want to lean, because you're going to stay that way for a while. And then underneath, this is again where the shared responsibility model, or these two gray areas, where Microsoft's like, well, we run the compute of the server, so you don't have to worry about that anymore. The storage, because you're going to have storage if you're going to do it this way. You're going to have a storage account or a blob inside of Azure where the profiles are going to be set. You can do it on file server. Most times you put on a blob, and then there's FX Logic that Microsoft acquired, and you get a free, quote unquote, free license that you use in Virtual Desktop, and that's how it manages when it has a user on the desktop and how it puts the profile into the storage location. But now I have to make sure who has access to that storage location. Make sure that storage location that's only supposed to be used for these profiles and just in this Virtual Desktop, that it's not accessible from the internet. So I have to make sure I block that off. So there's a couple of extra things to do there. I got to make sure the DNS settings are right internally to go do that. And then the networking that goes out, the outbound network or internal. So there's lots more things that you have to manage that you have to go through. And the cost really depends on, how much network access is going to be used, how much, your compute is going to be pretty much a fixed cost, because you're not, unless you turn it off and on. But there's lots of little pieces, and you have to really start to use it to see what the cost basis would be in my scenario when I go through it. Windows 365, you pretty much have what your price is going to be with a little variation, because it does give you an allotment of how much network capacity, right, in and out of the Microsoft network that you're going to get per month per user, and then you can pay an additional thing. But you can also route through Azure, but it's a whole nother topic. So here's what I was talking about, the different pools. So the one on the left is the single session, where it is 1 VM per person. Same thing that you're going to have on the Windows 365 side of it. And on the right-hand side of it, you'll see what we've traditionally known as remote desktop services, where it is 1 VM, but it's actually a server that is able to do this. But actually, it can also be a Windows 10 multi-session that it does. Here I have 10, but also 11. Office 365 Pro, But you can have 1 VM that is either running the server-based one, because you might have an application that wants to work in this way. You have other applications who don't behave well when it's in a multi-session type environment. We've known this for years. So you can have it as single session on the left-hand side. Both of these are possible in Azure Virtual Desktop. In Windows 365, it is only the one on the left, the host pool one, where it's always 1 VM, per user per person. Now, if you're going to be dealing with, users that are going to be doing CUI data, here's kind of an interesting sticking point. One is you probably want them to be isolated, so you're going to be on a single session per user VM anyway. So now you're really looking at those two pieces of, well, whether I do it in Azure Virtual Desktop or I do it Windows 365. And here's the other thing to consider, and it's one that I don't think gets enough play in certain places, but there's probably a feeling that if I do if I do the Azure Virtual Desktop, that because we as the, the organization has direct full control of that VM and that's doing CUI, that's better. But here's a little bit of the rub. In the Windows 365 side of it, where you don't get access to the VM, like the user can log in, but the IT person can say, I need to remote desktop into that computer to do something. Well, in that scenario, if you're doing Azure Virtual Desktop, you can do that, but are they supposed to do that? It might feel like, well, I need to go in there and fix something from them, but if that person has CUI data on their computer and they can remote desktop into that computer with admin permissions directly, and yes, you could log it and put other policies on it, but if they could do that and access the data, the fact that they didn't, but if they can, is that better? On the Windows 365 side of it, I don't think that was their intent to block that, but is the end effect where no, the user, if you have access to it, then you can go on, but you can't just backdoor and connect to the thing because you can't. So in that environment, say, well, Microsoft can get access. They have access to your email, they have access to all those things, but they don't really have access to it because, especially in GCC High, in order for somebody you call support and Microsoft support and say, okay, we're going to work on something like that. When you're in the GCC environment, another reason why the cost is so high is because they're all US-based people with additional background checks by the DoD. That's why you're in GCC High. You still want to acknowledge around the CUI stuff. But in order for them to get into your environment, look at the data, you have to give authorization. They send you an email with a PIN, you have to reside back, they do an authorization, and they're in. So they don't even get direct backdoor access into those things. So again, an additional part of the decision making in terms of cost or complexity in what you're going to go do. So let's talk about some architectures, some basic architecture. We're going to go through about 3 or 4 slides here to kind of build things up. If you're an organization where you are in GCC High, you don't really have any servers. Here I'm showing you have a subscription, and here I have a user, and they're just on the internet, right? So it's a customer in a building, but we're, wherever. I could be in the office or no office. I really don't have a true classic IT perimeter with, they sit in my office and have a firewall that's another layer of security. Really, the security starts at the person, then it starts at and then it gets layered on more by the device, by their access, all those sorts of things. So it's really about the person and the place where they start and layer it on. So if you're in this kind of scenario and you don't have anything here, why would we want to put in a lot of, we're gonna have to put in a virtual network, we're gonna have to put in the, the VMs. You're not gonna just do one VM for this, you're gonna do multiple VMs, because you're also gonna have to have a test and update pool, and then you're gonna have a regular pool, and then I can know how to switch them and make updates to it. And then, so now I have this infrastructure that I have to run and manage. If you have no local Active Directory today, why add that in? You can simply add on the Windows 365 service, all through Endpoint Manager, and keep things pretty much all cloud all the time. So, just one thing to consider. Maybe I am in all GCC High, all of our users are in here, and we have a local Active Directory where we do a sync. We also have a VPN gateway we set up. We have file server and then some other things that are on site. And in this environment, we do already have a lot of networking, and we have a need for some of the access that we're going to give to our contractor or for specific people in order to access line of business applications that still require it. So those are, it's like, hey, we're still on this one application. It requires a server. It has all these things. We're doing it anyway. So Azure Virtual Desktop becomes an easier possibility. But if you don't have VDI and you're still in this and you don't need those applications, then Windows 365 might be a consideration. But here with AVD, it's the Azure Virtual Desktop. You're a little closer to it being a fair option. Now let's go to the second scenario. This one is getting more and more common. The next one is probably even more common, where you have 2 tenants. Why would you have 2 tenants that you would do it? Well, some organizations, the government work they're going to do, the thing why they really need to protect CUI data in the contracts might be 1 contract, might be 2, it might just be 10% of your business or 25% of your users. And you really don't want to move everybody, because there's a cost side of it, not just the licensing part of it, but really migrating everybody over. And it might just be that you're in transition. We are going to eventually move everybody over, but we kind of need to get this done first and have that there because we have contractual obligation. I have no contractual obligations to move everybody over. So I may want to do this. There's extra burdens, right? Because I can't have 1 email address in both. I can't have a single, gal in that's all the way in both. There's ways to do it, but there's other headaches. But this is a good reason for me now. Now, again, in this scenario, one of the things that can happen is, well, we do have users that are primarily doing commercial, but sometimes need to do government things. And we don't just simply want to have the person on their commercial computer just log in to the GCC High website for email, because it's not fully protected. Yes, you can do things with automatic labeling and information protection to go do that, but but that's not really the point, right? There's greater complexity to this. So we want to make sure that not every organization is like this. So sometimes it's, hey, anytime they go to GCC High, even from a remote desktop, they need to be on a GCC High managed through Endpoint Manager desktop that we directly manage. Great. I mean, I love that. But some organizations, that's not so much of a requirement, and because there's different levels of CUI. So some of the CUI is not really required to do that. So lots of decision making there. But in this case, we want to have a person who is in our green area over here, and we want them to be able to access the government things periodically. right? Pretty frequently, periodically. So one of the ways to do that is through Windows 365. And by the way, something that also not talked about nearly as much is in Azure Active Directory, you can actually create rules, like a couple of rules. You can do one rule that says through the policies and everything that's here, because we're, for all those managed the desktops that we have for Windows 365, I can actually prevent access to the endpoints of government. So if they try to use it on their work, like, I'm just going to go to the website, it's going to say, oh, hey, those are endpoints we don't allow. Oh, it's not working, right? Because you got to go to the desktop. Second thing is you can actually restrict tenants. So you can say, hey, there's a tenant ID over there, and we don't allow working with that tenant in any way. So now I block endpoints and I block it. Well, how am I going to work? Well, here we go. Windows 365 or Azure Virtual Desktop. When you log in there, the world is your oyster. Do whatever you want in there. You're in it, and you can do what you want. So really ways to restrict, further blocking commercial people to do that, because you give them this avenue. So something also to consider. So now you have this virtual desktop that's in there, but in some scenarios, that's still not enough. So in here, you can see where we do have some existing infrastructure that we've, like, so this one is more prevalent in places where we have a local Active Directory. It's bound our Office 365, and even gives further reason why they say, well, we're in transition, because that's a lot of stuff to move and change, and some organizations may never change this, and that's because of because of their mixture of services that give, hey, half and half of our business, and it's considerable. There's stuff in government, so you might have some users that primarily only reside in the Azure government space with their desktop and mobile devices. We don't even give them access to that on the commercial side. However, they still might have we still might have a corporate email. We still might want them to log into Teams or the SharePoint website, because we've got HR things there and finance things there, manager meeting and staffing things. So we do want to give them access into, remember, they're living their whole life in GCC High, but they need to access commercial things. At that point, you could just say, well, they can just do it through the web, right? Because on their desktop, I don't want them to really be able to have two different profiles. And fun fact here for you, if you have a mobile device that's being managed through your GCC High policies, you cannot connect it to a commercial one. It was a Highlander, there can only be one or something. So that's one of the scenarios. The thing, the reason I'm bringing this up, especially as we're talking about virtual desktop or Azure Virtual Desktop, is we start talking about access. Who needs to get access to it? And so in this, you might have people who are living their whole lives in GCC High, doing whatever they want, and you could actually virtual desktop into the commercial side if you wanted to do that, because they need actually to do some they live 90% of their life in government, 10% working on maybe commercial projects, and the web page stuff isn't enough. So you might have it on the other end. You could have both, right? So this is where it gets a little trickier, and you really got to think about your personas. So we do projects on Windows 365, and even though we're doing it just for that, or Azure Virtual Desktop, we always talk about personas. Is it a contractor? What do they need access? Hey, when the contractor goes in, again, another area to consider that works in both places. Maybe what I want to put on is to say, when the contractors, this would be something you do through a conditional access policy. So when contractors try to access Office 365, anything, we block them, unless they are accessing it from those devices. That's the remote desktop ones. Either way, virtual desktop or Windows 365. Control it through IPs and applications. Lots of different ways to do it. But this way, it's like, hey, we gave you a license to use it. When you log into the desktop, do whatever you want, right? We have everything in control there, but niche, and you can't do it from some other place, so how do we block access? So conditional access works along with this to prevent that. So again, when we think about the differences, think about what your current architecture is, or what your architecture will be. You might be in transition. You can make changes. Could you have Windows 365 connect to your local Active Directory that you already have, and that's how you want it bound? Yes, you could do that. Can you have Windows 365 that's directly connected to your local AD, or something like Azure Active Directory domain services, because you're using legacy applications, and have a different set of devices? Either one person can have both, or for a different group of people, and that one is directly managed against Azure Active Directory only, so no need for local AD. Can I do both at the same time? Yes, you can do that at the same time. Can I have Azure Virtual Desktop do it the same? Not so much flexible on the endpoint manager piece of it. You know, it still works a little bit better, I think, with Azure Active Directory domain services or local Active Directory. But if you were going to do anything with local Active Directory, I think with Active Directory at all, because of legacy applications, whatever, I'd strongly guide you towards Azure Active Directory domain services, because it's like having domain controllers, but they're Microsoft's managing it. Because when you eventually want to transition out of local Active Directory altogether, if that's your path, there's just another set of headaches that you have to go through and change and profiles. I mean, it's a burden. Then, really in both scenarios, even harder on the Azure Virtual Desktop side, because they're all kind of bound to your local AD. Anyhow, so, if depending on the scenario that you're coming from, the need from the applications, the amount of complexity, and the amount of IT knowledge that you have, it starts to guide you towards, one versus the other that you're doing it. So hopefully that gives you, a little bit of guidance. So, again, when we're looking at the Windows 365 for enterprise side, you get to kind of choose the form factor that you want in terms of the size. But, and then each one of these options, whether it's 8, virtual CPUs with 32 gigs and 128, that's one option. 2 virtual CPUs with 4 gigs and 256 gigs of memory, that's another option. These are all options that you have to make a decision on what to buy. People can move up in size, but you have to buy a new license for them. You don't really see that a lot when you're just dealing with emails, right? They have email, they get on this and access to applications. This, you really kind of have to know it. And it's even harder when you're buying off the AOSG price list, or if you're in an EA, that one can be a little bit different. But you normally have these kind of commits that you have to do it. So, think about that as you go through it. But, if you can quickly get into place before you can, get an exchange or refund, whatever, there's ways to kind of go through and manage it. But each one of these has a direct price. When we're thinking about the Azure Virtual Desktop and what its pricing structure looks like, it's a little bit easier. So remember, the one thing I was talking about was when you're doing Azure Virtual Desktop, it's all consumption based, right? It's how many CPUs how many virtual machines you get, the size of it, the amount of storage that you're going to eventually grow into, the backup storage you're going to get into, the network. It is in Azure, if you've been doing it, no different than if you're doing, in some other place, something that's all like, oh, it's only like 0.0013 cents, per whatever. Things add up, so you got to keep an eye on it, and it can add up quickly. And then you really have to go through some maintenance to kind of reduce that cost. Are we putting too many, backup, backups in place? We're doing full backups every day of everything. Well, okay, do we really need that? Or can we do updates? And hey, these things spin up and spin down. Do we really need to back up all of our VMs when we go through this? The answer normally is yes, but not so long, because I have backups in there. If they all died, I can just respin them up, but it's a process to spin it up. It's now you have to delete the old one, spin the other one up. Sometimes there's post configuration you have to do if you haven't automated it, or whatever else, sure things are linked up. So sometimes having the right amount of backups is just so that you can get back into service quickly and get them there. But you don't need that same backup of something that the desktop has changed and updated Office and updated patches. I don't need that copy of that backup of that VM in Azure Virtual Desktop from a year ago. It's really not going to help us. So maybe I don't need as many snapshots for as long, but it really comes down to our recovery time, how fast we want that. But again, more things you have to think of. On that Windows 365 side, they pretty much do all that for you, so it's much easier to do it. You just set some policies. So these are things to think about. Oh, so when you're doing, if you have a license that has Windows 365 E3 rights, right? So you have to look at your license. Sometimes it gets packaged different from different license providers, and they'll say they have it or not. But if you have it's something on there that's associated with VM rights that's already assigned to the user, when you put them into a pool in Azure Virtual Desktop, when the images are spun up, there's an additional flag that you put on those images in the pool that says, I don't remember the exact name of the value, but essentially says we use Linux pricing, because and you have to make sure that the users that access those VMs have that virtual desktop rights, because essentially what it's saying is, Microsoft's saying is it's included in your license. So we're not double charging you for the OS because you already have in your license. So now just tell the VMs that it's Linux-based pricing, and that gets things cheaper. How much cheaper? It's hard to say because I don't know what your licensing plan is, and you know, they discounted it or do whatever. But you can sort that out, whatever that is. Again, this is a place where the Azure pricing calculator is your friend. And an Azure pricing calculator does have the regions for Azure government. So pick the right region that you're in, pick that side, it'll tell you the general pricing for it for consumption. And again, then you have to match it with your licensing provider for any discounts you might have, or packaging, whatever that is. So lastly, and then again, when you think about the compliance part of this, right? Hey, I'll do Azure Virtual Desktop more flexible and these things. Okay, you have servers that you manage for those. You have the virtual desktops that you directly manage. So what's your patching schedule, update documentation process? How do you get the evidence to make sure that it's happening that way? How do you make sure you prevent IT people, if they're not supposed to get access to CUI data, are not getting access to CUI data? So again, with the Azure Virtual Desktop, it's extremely flexible, and you can say, hey, we only need it for a certain period of time. So you can turn it all off, and you can turn it all on. You can scale them up, Monday morning at 2 a.m., get ready for the work week, and then gradually spin them down, Friday evening, because you don't have the staff there, where you could save money. But somebody from IT has to be diligent. Yes, you can automate those things, but you have to check on those things, because as we all know, things go wrong, things change. But you also have to make sure that if I have only one IT person that knows how to do this, and they transition, they go sick, they go on vacation, it's a lot more headache. But again, those are decisions that you all really should make. Oh, sorry, I'm clicking the wrong button, going the wrong way. Okay, so really in summary, when you think about this, hopefully this gives you an understanding of really, one is understanding the architecture that you're in or you're about to go in. And this will help you understand, which architecture should I use, and you could do both. If you're transitioning between tenants, you might say, well, because really the other thing is, if you've never done Windows Virtual Desktop before and you're going to try and do it yourself, you could, but there's a lot of things to hack through and make it secure for the things that you want. So you normally go through a partner like ourselves, and we kind of get you. And there's way more upfront cost, because we got to pay for a project, and it's spun up, is that what you like? For something that you might go, yeah, but we're not going to use it, but like 3 times a year, and it's only for 3 people. The cost of doing that for just Windows 365, we still onboard customers to help them out, because you still want to have the right strategy of how you do the licensing compared to what you deploy, the policies they have. But in the end, you have more kind of policy definitions versus a lot of infrastructure. It's still policy defined, but things they have to keep track of. It's CPU capacity, it's availability, spinning up them. There's just more to it. So if you already come from that life, it's not so bad, going into that. And so really it comes down to understanding your architecture, your existing IT staffing, what architecture you're going to have going into the future, and what level of complexity you're going to have. And I get this question a lot, and I'm sure I didn't give you the right answer for it, which is, but tell me which one is going to be best for me in the cost. It's I don't know if you have line of business applications that they need to have. I don't know, like, the different scenarios that you're going to have, personas, where they can be coming from. And one last little nugget I'll give you as we kind of wrap this up here is, we think about when you go into this environment, most time when people think about security, they think permissions, right? Because they come from the environment of I'm going to give you permissions to this folder or to this mailbox or something. It's permissions. Good security takes that and wraps it around with a greater amount of intent. And intent really is about the persona, because what I would do for a contractor that needs to come in to work, either because they're on a government contractor with me, or they're a contractor that's working on something in marketing or whatever else, what do they need? When do they need it? How do they need? Because some people, like business users, I might want them to have the ability to print stuff at home and do whatever. Same environment, same everything else, except it's for a contractor that is working on CUI data for us. And when they log in, I don't want to have those kind of permissions and policies, and I want to lock things down and they can't go through this. So the greater intent is what needs to understand there, and our skills and what we want. that starts to get us to what decision we want. Pricing it is very difficult on the Azure Virtual Desktop, because even as you go through the calculator, it'll give you rough costs, but you don't know until your application is in there and how much data you're going through. A little bit the same with Azure Virtual Desktop, but again, just greater control. Anyhow, hopefully this gave you at least some information to look at, things to consider, where are you in your architecture, and kind of lead you in that way. And for some, this might have helped you say, well, okay, based off that architecture stuff and complexity, we're going to go this way or that way. For others, maybe at least it opens up new questions that you need to think about and search for answers in order to make a decision. But at the end of the day, they're both fantastic technologies, both supported in the GCC high space. Shared responsibility model is also a key thing in terms of compliance and kind of deciding one versus the other or both. So with that, I want to thank you for all of that. I think now we'll lead into some additional questions and go from there.
Excellent. Thank you, Conrad. We did have a couple of good questions come in through the chat during the webinar. So the first one, which I'm kind of excited about, is, so with Windows 365, we can still have the Intune configuration policies in place and just deploy them to the cloud PCs, which means users could potentially be allowed to bring their own devices and just use the cloud PC and still be compliant with HIPAA, CMMC, et cetera.
I'll answer that with a mostly yes, and a little bit of it depends. Yeah, and the one thing that whenever we talk about meeting compliance, we put a lot of pieces in here that we start off in our projects and with our advisor services and recurring services to provide the security controls that you need. But a lot of times in compliance, it also comes down to practice and documentation and getting the right evidence. So putting in the technology doesn't get you all the way there, but it's the other pieces. So you could certainly do something like that. And the reason I say it is depending on what the program office tells you in the government side, that there might be, just because you're CMMC, level 2, and let's say you get audited and you pass it, doesn't mean that the program office or the contract can't stick something in there that says access to whatever initiates from a controlled, managed physical device. Yeah, and
good answer.
And when you get to that, so you got to look at that. And when you get to that, now we open up another interesting thing, which is, we've done this before, which is I could actually supply my users with this little $300 terminal device that also has TPM that I manage like a kiosk. So when you log in, the only thing you see on there, like there's no applications or whatever, only thing I see is remote desktop. So that little thing is still managed through Endpoint Manager. It's controlled to what it needs to do. So I fit that requirement. And when I double click on it, it opens up the remote desktop and voila, I have everything that we want, we talk about. So that's another route to kind of maybe satisfy that. If you don't have that, I can't tell you if you'll pass that requirement. What I can tell you is that technically, yes, you'd have this more controlled environment remote that you can still all manage, through Endpoint Manager, and you can do both, but your policies that you'll have some policies that says, I really restrict these things for all Windows 11, except if one of those devices is marked as a cloud PC device. So that's where you do filtering on-site Endpoint Manager.
Great, thanks, Conrad. Next question is, if you're using Teams phones, will that operate through Windows 365?
Teams phone, well, the Teams phone is just, if the Teams phone is plugged, so one thing is that you can control inside of Endpoint Manager, you can say, I want to block all USB devices that are not approved. So you can't put in approved device types. Because you're going to want to have a computer, and so here the Teams phone, there's a couple ones you can do. One that's directly plugged in, and that's just a managed endpoint, right, device. If it's a team phones that plugs into the computer, well then that's where you'd have to say, I block everything, but you're cool, type of thing.
The next question we've got is, how would the service desk support someone remotely for Windows 365?
Good question. So for so many of the policies that you have so you know, in that question, it's the traditional ways that we've had the help desk access is you install an agent, some third-party device, or even team viewer or something like that. You could still do that. You can actually, so one thing in Windows 365, why you can put things into a pick from the gallery, which is what most people do. And I said, hey, on Azure Virtual Desktop, you can define what your images are. You can actually do the same thing in Windows 365. But remember, Endpoint Manager is also good at pushing applications and packages down. So you could say for the Cloud PVC ones, we still push an agent. I'm not really recommending this part, but you could, and put like Team Viewer on it. But now inside of Endpoint Manager, if you look at the devices, there's a new remote help option. So you would go, the person could go into Endpoint Manager. You can, you know, there's different roles that you can give them, and actually go and say, I want to start a remote session with this person and access that. So now you have to have, you know, is it the right people that should have access to that? That's one thing. You know, so you could still get access in kind of that way. You know, if you're going to do third-party agents in a GCC high environment, that's doing, you know, CY data. The question I'd always have there is the vendor that's creating that connection, because it's not going point to point, it's going through this service, are they FedRAMP high? Greg, because remember, GCC high, Government Community Cloud high, it's the designation from FedRAMP high. So, you know, if are they on that list? They're not. Well, I don't think we can use that. So now we got to look at other things. Like I said, you look at the Endpoint Manager, the remote help option might be a good thing. Maybe they open up Teams, but Teams have problems that's not working. So yes, we have to look at other possibilities. But you know, so those would be some of the strategies to provide, you know, to provide help injecting directly into the customer environment. But even there, you always want it to be where the customer accepts, because if not, what prevents an IT support staff person that doesn't have CY access? Like, I'm just going to go into their computer because they wanted something installed. I'm just going to do it while they're not there, and like, oh, check out this folder. You know, so well, our people wouldn't do that. You know, in a compliance world, that's number one, a no-no. Second world, in a secure world, very much a no-no. You know, just because I trust my people, not going to do it. Generally, we want to trust our people, but sometimes, you know, literally 2 years ago, we had to help a customer because their IT staff all quit at the same time. What they didn't see is that they were actually turning off certain policies, alerts. They were deleting things before they all left. It was a mass thing. It was crazy. So trust but verify. You know, I was in the Marine Corps. This is you know, trust but verify and check all those things. But anyway, hopefully that answers part of the question.
Great. Next one, what are the Windows 365 licensing timeframe commitments?
Because Windows 365 licensing is just a user license, it's the same type of anything you do user license. You're going to buy another Microsoft 365 E5. I'm 6 months into my 12-month term on my AOSG contract. So typically, again, you got to go to your license provider because they might have special rules or whatever. But typically, you'd end up paying for the remainder of the year that you do. If you're coming from an EA, you know, EA has other kinds of things where they do, you know, purchase and true ups and licensing, but that one can be very customized. So you have to talk to your license provider. But normally when you're doing that, it's like that. If you're coming from, you know, you could be doing something in GCC moderate, which is essentially commercial, and that one you're doing a still kind of more traditional CSP, you know, government that's there. You know, now you have the thing where you can buy it and make the commitment for a year at a cheaper rate versus an inflated rate if you want the flexibility month to month. You know, I would always say, you know, do the month to month until you get to the point of like, yeah, this is the one that we want, and then you know, kick it in for a year. And I forgot to bring this up on the Azure Virtual Desktop side. Once you spin up all those VMs or whatever, you can make commitments called reserved instances that says, hey, we have these VMs running, humming, we can add a couple more, and we're going to commit to having it basically on, running all the time. And we're going to get, you know, it could be 20-30% discount. It can go higher if you reserve it for a year. But now, you know, you're really making a commitment into something like that. So there's strategies to save money. I always say, try not to save money when you first start out, because now you're committed. That's how that works. Pay the extra cost, because you should only be doing it for a few months, and then right size it the way you want, and then kind of get there.
Right. And finally, this is a comment, not a question, but very important. It is, you will fail any audit for CMMC if you are running Windows 11, as it's not yet FIPS certified. I'm going to go ahead and put a link to Microsoft's Learn page on this. They are currently pursuing the FIPS validation for Windows 11, but that comment is correct. Windows 11 does not have the FIPS certification from NIST yet.
Yeah, great point.
Thank you very much for bringing that up.
Yeah, that's why again I say I can't tell you where you're going to pass in these things, but here you would have the option, really, in either case. And by the way, if you bought a Windows 365 and you're on Windows 10 and you're using it because the FIPS certification or the applications, and then it goes to the point, oh, you know what, we're ready to go to Windows 11, you don't have to buy another license. It's the same one. You just you could create a new provisioning policy for that's pointed to that gallery, or you can actually change it, the provisioning policy that defines what OS gets put onto that gets made available to what select group of users. But anyway, you don't have to buy an additional license, so that's nice. On the Azure Virtual Desktop, you don't have to do that either, but now you have to spin up new images, test those things out. It's just more complicated. For my IT love affair, I love challenges to go through them, but it might not be the challenges that you want. But that's a great point.
Yep, and that person came back and said there are also issues with the latest versions of Windows. I have pasted that link into the chat. I'll put that down in the YouTube description as well, so that you can validate which version of Windows are currently validated for FIPS. Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Conrad. That was great. I'll be uploading the webinar video to our YouTube channel this evening, and we will have a blog recap next week. I'll send out an email notification for that. In the chat, I've posted a short link to our YouTube channel if you want to get this out to your team tonight. We've had a couple comments around that, and that URL is agilit.co/tube. Very easy to remember. Thanks again, Conrad.
You're welcome. Thanks everybody for joining. Appreciate you being here, and like to see more people at the next webinars. And Sean, is there a way that people can send comments to us if there's other topics they'd love for us to get into?
You know what? I can actually, when I send out the recap, I will solicit that in that email.
Cool. Yeah, if you guys have questions or other things, we'd love to talk about it, and so just send it along.
Great. And if you're watching it on YouTube, go ahead and make a comment.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.